So I often talk to landlords about the value of every single minute. Today we're talking all about the value of time and its importance in the landlording process. Let's get started. So I imagine that you understand the importance of time and its value, but in almost no place is it more evident in the landlording process. Every single day that passes that a tenant is not paying rent on time is wasted time, and every single minute of wasted time is wasted money in the landlording process. And so today I want to talk to you a little bit about the ways that we can address these issues and what we can do to make sure that our time is spent well so that our money is spent well. Understand that every single lease goes through a very predictable life cycle. A lease life cycle starts and ends every single time. The expectation for every single lease is that it will come to an eventual end. There's always a pre-lease, and in the pre-lease, this is where you are essentially securing your tenant. You're doing your best to find out whether or not the prospective tenants that you're evaluating will ultimately be profitable for you. You're going to screen them, their history, their employment, their credit, and whether or not they've had an eviction at all in the past. These are all important elements that you're going to look through to make sure that you're only selecting from among the most qualified applicants. Of course, once you've determined who is going to reside on the property and you've signed a contract and you've handed over your keys, you have your lease term. Now, theoretically, throughout the lease term, you are making the maximum amount of money as a landlord you're ever going to make. During that term, you're collecting your rent, and if it comes to it, you're collecting late fees and potentially other fees that come from things like damages to the property or fees for other matters having to do with the tenant's use of the property. For example, pet fees or pet charges. However, your losses will begin at the point of holdover. And holdover is that segment of time when the tenant is still in possession but is no longer paying rent. This might be a period of time near the end or at the end where the tenant, for whatever reason, just simply stops paying. And this is a point in time when the landlord must act the fastest. It doesn't make sense to waste time in this process because every day that goes by is just additional loss. The reason why the tenant is not paying is less important than the fact that the tenant simply isn't paying for the time that they are occupying the premises. It is this time when the landlord must be the most diligent to either enforce the terms of the lease to get the tenant to pay, or to enforce the terms of the lease to make sure that that tenant is removed from the premises as quickly as possible. Once the tenant is removed, then the process of rehabilitation of the unit begins, and it's also at this time when the landlord wants to act with efficiency to make sure that the property can be put back on the market and that a new prospective tenant can be sought. Once the property is ready to list, it's put back on the market and the life cycle begins anew. Prospective tenants are advertised to and ultimately brought in. Once the pre-leasing begins and the screening begins, the life cycle begins all over. And it's important for a landlord to understand in their mind that this is a cycle, that you are unlikely to have a continuous loop of rent payment from one tenant to the next, that there will always be some sort of gap in between each tenant, but that also the amount of time that the tenant is in possession of a property is key, and it's important to make sure that each tenant that is in possession of property is actively paying for their use of that property. The longer that any tenant goes without paying means the longer the losses that you will experience. Additionally, the longer a gap in between paying tenants, the more loss you will incur and the less financial gain and the less profitability you'll get from your rental property. Giving us a thumbs up if you are learning something in today's video. If you enjoy what you see here, we appreciate your questions and your comments, which I review myself. Thanks. So what can a landlord do in order to improve their efficiencies when a tenant is in place? Well, one extremely important thing for a landlord to be is efficient with their landlording. This means you must have a plan in place. You can expect your tenant to default in some way, to be late with a payment, or to be unable to make payment, to breach the contract in some way, either with damage to the property or with an unauthorized occupant or an unauthorized pet, in some way causing economic harm to you and to the rental property. If you have a plan in place for dealing with these very predictable breaches, then you can deal with them in a way that is quick and potentially sidestep things turning into a mountain of a problem. If you're able to effectively and efficiently deal with a problem, then you're the least likely to experience the greatest degree of harm. For example, if you immediately issue notice when you find that a tenant has an unauthorized pet on the property, you issue written notice for that tenant to remove the pet, or you issue written notice for that tenant to pay a certain amount in accordance with the lease as previously agreed. You might have a $500 pet charge in the lease that is applicable as rent even once that tenant has violated the pet provision of your lease. That eventual non-payment or the failure on the part of the tenant to remove that pet could ultimately result in eviction. But in order to efficiently remove this tenant, you must be diligent with your notices. Additionally, a good landlord is always educated on what the law says. What are the time frames that a tenant is entitled to with regard to, say, a notice to vacate? What makes sense in terms of how quickly can you run to the courthouse when a tenant has committed a purely non-rent lease violation? I tend to tell landlords that unless you have a very egregious violation of the lease, some really big thing that nobody would argue with you about your election to have that tenant terminated and removed from the property. If you have smaller offenses, then there should be repeated offenses that have gone unheeded or have not been properly cured. For example, if you have a tenant who simply has not cut the grass, and you've reminded them time and time again, but there are no written notice of it, it's difficult for you to establish this as a valid basis for removal. But if you sent written notice after written notice after written notice warning the tenant that continued violation of this provision of the lease will ultimately result in a notice to vacate, then you have a higher degree of likelihood that you'll be able to remove them through the eviction process. Additionally, your state may require a certain number of days, minimally, before you are able to terminate a lease. Perhaps your state requires that you give an opportunity for your tenant to cure lease violations. In the state of Texas, there is no such provision, and a tenant can be issued a notice to vacate upon a single violation of non-payment. And even if that tenant attempts to tender the amount, it may be that your court finds that insufficient as a means to recover, and that a terminated lease means that the landlord has the right to seek possession. However, consider the facts. Even if the court might otherwise allow it, if we're talking about a very small amount that a tenant did ultimately tender, your judge may decide that it's simply not enough of a violation for an eviction to be granted. But if we're talking about an entire month of rent, or the majority of rent, or even half of a month of rent that was never tendered, you're very likely then, in the eyes of the court, to have sufficient grounds for termination. That's where your written notice comes in. If the tenant failed to vacate in accordance with that notice, then you're much likelier to be able to receive an eviction judgment. And finally, you want your procedure to always be effective. You want to be educated so you know what the law requires of you, but then you want to exercise your rights under the law every single time. If there are very specific ways for you to, for example, deliver a notice, then you want to make sure that you have effectively delivered that notice. It's not enough to know that a notice is required. If you don't know how to effectively deliver it, then you may find yourself unable to effectuate an eviction once you present your eviction claim to the eviction court. Along with having a plan in place, you want to make sure that you've done it in accordance with the law, and that effectively you have sent notice and filed a petition that the court will accept. Ineffective notice tends to be one of the easiest ways for landlords simply not to get the remedy that they seek whenever they file an eviction. An ineffective notice is an easy way for a tenant to challenge a lawsuit for eviction in an eviction court. Your lease might address what it means to send an effective notice. Many leases have a notice provision, or they have limitations on when a notice is effective. Make sure you understand your lease and that you understand the effectiveness of any notice that you send to your tenant. Now, when it comes to losses, what can you do to limit those losses, if not eliminate them entirely? Well, one thing that helps landlords is to conduct inspections. If you simply hand over keys to a tenant and never see the unit again until they hand the keys back to you at the end of their tenancy, you're essentially setting yourself up for a great deal of disappointment. However, if you plan inspections and you inspect the property routinely, you're going to find that small problems that begin when effectively addressed don't turn into bigger problems. For example, you may have a requirement in your lease for the tenant to replace the filters for the air conditioning once a month. And you may have, as part of your regular inspections, a routine of inspecting a property after the first 3 months, which is something we strongly encourage. If you can get to the property after the 3rd month and after the 9th month, then you are effectively inspecting your property and can detect these small things. For example, the air conditioning filter. If after 3 months you've noticed that it's the exact same filter that you put in there before these tenants took possession, you can let your tenant know, look, you were asked to replace this after every single month. Because you haven't done this, I'm issuing a notice of default. Please replace this filter. In fact, you may have a filter with you and you replace it so that when you come back 6 months later after month 9, if it's that same filter, I would issue a notice again. And this tells you a couple of things about your tenant. Number one, that they're not doing the bare minimum that you've requested. And so again, another notice of default should be issued at this time. But it also tells you that it may be somebody that you're not interested in signing a lease renewal with. Again, you don't want to renew year after year after year just to find out after 3 or 4 years you got the same filter that was there at the beginning of the lease. This is something that you can easily detect. By having a routine inspection of the property, you can minimize damage, especially with these small things that are easy to detect and easy to address. Another easy way to mitigate landlord losses is to repair with diligence. The moment you find that a repair is needed, you're going to want to address that with diligence. You're going to want to get in there quickly and get in there well, which means don't simply get something repaired, get it done right. There's probably a few things that you can handle, but I'm pretty sure most landlords can't handle every single repair themselves, although they might try to their own detriment. Understand where your limits are. If you can do X, Y, and Z, but nothing more, then stick with that and leave the rest to the pros. When you repair, make sure that you repair with top quality material and with top quality expertise. The fact that you can get something done may not be a good enough reason for you to actually try your hand at it, because quality is important. And if you're looking to deliver a top quality product to your tenant every single time, that is going to include the repairs that you institute for your own rental property. Have in mind that you will get an excellent job done every time a repair is needed. And that might be you, but it may be somebody else that you get in there who you know and trust to do a quality job every single time. Remember, this is your most valuable asset, that rent house, and it's important to make sure that it is well maintained and well repaired whenever the need arises. Finally, an extremely effective way of reducing your losses is to evict quickly. Too many times landlords give chance after chance after chance to someone who simply can't pay the full amount of rent, or they can't seem to pay it on time. I'm a big believer in giving an opportunity for your tenant to make up for a mistake or make up where things just aren't going well for them. But if you do it more than once in a given 12-month period, then you're asking for losses. And these are losses that you can mitigate against. This is why a security deposit is in place. But generally speaking, a security deposit is about 1 month. Yours might be more, but it's not generally much more than that. And so if a tenant habitually pays late or is unable to pay a full amount on time when it's due, then again, you can waive it one time, you can forgive it once, but if you're doing it repeatedly, you're just inviting loss. You're going to want to proceed with an eviction quicker than you probably feel comfortable doing. And by doing this quickly, if you have a tenant who does ultimately mean to set things right, they will. But more often than not, a tenant who is behind or who simply can't afford the unit anymore isn't going to get caught up. And by starting the eviction process sooner rather than later, you're going to minimize your ultimate losses. Yes, landlording can be difficult, but if you have a plan in place and you understand what the law requires of you and you are effective in the way that you carry out your landlording, you are the least likely to lose money. Additionally, if you are diligent with your property and go in and conduct routine inspections and make repairs when they're required and you do them well, and when things go awry and you have to evict, you are diligent with your own property and with your own lease to make sure that your tenant is compliant on all respects, then you are likely to have the most effective landlording business that you can, and you're less likely to lose money. By making sure that you understand the value of your time and the value of each day that passes, you are going to be the most successful in the landlording game. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. There's a video right here that YouTube seems to think is absolutely perfect for you. Watch it and enjoy the rest of the programming on this channel. I hope that you do. And until next time, landlords, happy leasing.